Dear student, we will continue with Darwinism. So first we'll just compare the Darwinism and Lamarckism. So they both believed that organism adapted to their environment and passed on the adaptations to the next generation. Now, just by taking considering the example of giraffe, as the Darwin he gave the explanation of the giraffe, so this will help you to understand what was the distinguish between two theories. So according to the Darwin, the giraffe had natural variation in the neck length, and that those with the longer necks were able to betterly survive and reproduce in the environment full of tall trees. So subsequent generation had more and more long giraffe. Okay. So here you can say Lamarckism. He said that every subsequent generation the offspring accumulated the variation, or there was a use of particular, you can say, a use of certain organ, and that get accumulated over a period of time. Okay, and this leads to the evolution. But what Darwin said that there were two different there were two different uh, divergence from one single deer like animal, and uh, the one which get adapted with a new trait, that is the long neck, they survive and they reproduce. The one with the shorter, they could not survive because um, of the competition of the food. So this is what is the explanation of both. Okay. Now, what were the drawbacks or what were the criticism point regarding the Darwinism? The theory of pangenesis was opposed by Weizmann theory of germplasm. According to the pangenesis, each and every cell produces hereditary particle called panges, and the objection was the germ cell and the somatic cells are different, so somatic changes cannot influence the germ cell. So this was given by Weizmann. Now, according to the Darwin, inheritance of small variation is raw material for evolution. Okay. Objection was the small variation are not useful in ancestor, but still they got selected in the subsequent generation. For what reason? The next is existence of vestigial organ. The objection was their existence cannot be explained by natural selection as they are of no use to the organism. Then fourth is over speciation of certain organ like tusk of elephant, antler of deer. So they cannot explain Darwinism as instead of their usefulness in the organism's life, they are hindrances. Darwin explained survival of fittest but not the arrival of fittest. That means he explained what is the reason that how the survival of fittest occur, but he was unable to explain that how new species came into the existence. So he could not explain actually the mechanism of variation. Okay. Now I will just see now application in today's scenarios. Okay, so first is the artificial selection. Artificial selection is the process by which humans choose individual organism with certain phenotypic trait that is desirable by human value for breeding, and this is also called as selective breeding. The artificial selection uses the mechanism of natural selection, but unlike natural selection, artificial selection does not result in the evolution or speciation. The domesticated animal and plant were selected on the basis of phenotypic trait to produce crossbreeds, and phenotypic trait means useful variation. These are the useful variation that are to be selected. The selection is made by farmers. So here there is no natural selection, but human being, or you can say the farmer, is selecting. Okay, So selection is in the control manner to bring the higher productivity. Now, what is the selection pressure over here? It is the productivity and better quality. Now, what is the mechanism for the breeding? Inbreeding, line breeding, outbreeding, not natural, but it is artificial. Only the breed that are useful to the human are selected, and the rest of are not selected and taken care of. So this is called artificial selection. The artificial selection also decreases the genetic diversity in population, as most of the species are breed with each other, increasing the homozygosity of genotype, where the natural selection increases the genetic diversity. So here we can differentiate the natural selection with the artificial selection. Okay. Next example is the coevolution study. Coevolution is the process of a reciprocal evolutionary change that occurs between the pair of species as they interact with each other. Okay, now what do you mean by interact with each other? Mutually depend on one another or associated as prey predator or host parasite. What is the evolutionary change? First, one species evolve a response. First, one species evolve a response to a trait of the second species, and then this is followed by the response of the second species to the first. Okay, so this is called reciprocal effect. Okay, coevolution is observed in various forms such as competitive species and mutualistic coevolution, parasitic host coevolution. For example, flowering plant associated with pollinator. Okay, so here coevolution of insect with flower. The floral nectar is present inside flower close to reproductive organ. Insect visit flower for the nectar and simultaneously do the pollination. Darwin proposed that long proboscis, uh, proboscis pollinator and long tubed flower might be engaged in the reciprocal selection. That is what there is selection pressure from one to another and vice versa. Proboscis are actually long appendages coming out of the animal's head. Okay. Now the proboscis help to suck the nectar in long tube flower. The more is the length of proboscis, the more tubular flower is pollinated by the insect. So both evolve gradually. Coevolution is considered as the mechanism to create biodiversity on Earth. Now, next example is of industrial melanism, which occurred in 19th century. Um, this is also an example of natural selection or selective survival. Industrial melanism is an evolutionary effect prominent in several arthropods where dark pigmentation, that is melanism, has evolved in an environment affected by industrial pollution due to sulfur dioxide, dark soot deposit, etc. Now, industrial melanism is widespread in Lepidoptera species, that is butterfly and moth, and almost 70 species of the moth in England were affected by industrial melanism. So, industrial melanism is studied well in the peppered moth, which is known as Bichon butyllaria. The peppered moth exists in two forms, light and dark. Now, what was the observation? Before industrial revolution, the population of light colored moth was dominated over the dark one, but after industrial revolution progress, the dark color got dominated. Now, what is the mechanism operated, or we can say how the natural selection operated over here? So, see, during the industrial revolution, number of industries increased. The soot released from the industries started coating the tree trunk. Okay. Now, if you see these tree trunk were earlier mottled gray due to the presence of lichen, because there was no pollution, so there was deposition of lichen on the trunk of the trees, and this makes good habitat for light colored moth, so they can easily camouflage in this environment. The tree trunk now become dark because of the pollution, creating selection pressure. Moreover, the lichen disappeared because of the pollution. So now the dark one have more advantage of camouflage. So this is now here operated the variation in the trait is the dark one is favored, and the selection pressure was pollution which causes the change in the environment, and camouflage. So because of this the survival of fittest occur. The light one were disadvantaged due to easily being pointed out by their predator. The first dark colored pepper moth was seen in 1845, but by 1866, that is over a period of time, only few years you can say, the dark colored moth become dominant. Okay, so the new variant is known as Butyllaria carbonaria. So this is a step towards speciation. The dark moth betterly camouflage in the dark forest as compared to the light one. So the dark had more time to breed. So this is differential reproduction and survival. The evolution of peppered moth is an evolutionary instance of directional color change or directional. This is also known as directional selection in moth population as the consequence of pollution during the industrial revolution. The frequency of dark color moth increases with time. So this is what we call as directional selection. Peppered moth is also an example of protective coloration or cryptic coloration, as the moth is protected from the predator by blending with the surrounding very well. So this is also known as cryptic coloration. So, or we can say better adaptation. You can see this is how the tree trunk were covered by lichen, and this is later on the lichen disappear. Light color and dark color peppered moth. Okay, so these are few examples that explains the Darwin's theory of natural selection. So here we complete with the Darwinism. Thank you.